Welcome to SHOWstudio. We're here today to talk about fashion and its relationship with Brexit. Perhaps an unhappy relationship, but an important relationship nonetheless, because fashion is obviously an incredibly important industry within the UK, and it's something that needs to be discussed and talked about in relationship to what this deal that is being negotiated is going to have on our young designers and our amazing creative industry in London. Part of this discussion is to try and speculate on some of the problems and the issues or the opportunities that might be caused by the Brexit deal. I think none of us here want to spend too long looking back. I think it's very much about pragmatically and sort of openly discussing things that need to be given a forum. Obviously, we are aware that a lot of this is going to be speculation because a deal is still being negotiated, but I think it's really important that people who are working within the fashion industry feel like they're included in that discussion and that they have a forum, as hopefully this will offer to voice concerns that are shared by not only them but other people that they're working alongside. I've got a brilliant set of people with me who are very qualified to have this discussion, so before we sort of dig into the debates, I'll let everyone introduce themselves.
Okay, so I'm Tamara Cincik and my background is as a fashion stylist, and more recently I've been working in politics.
I'm Munira Mirza. I was Deputy Mayor for Culture and Education in London for 8 years, and now I work on a range of projects to support the arts and creative industries.
I'm Adam Mansell. I'm the Chief Executive of the UK Fashion and Textile Association. We're the largest fashion and textile network in the UK, representing about 2,500 companies.
I'm Phoebe English and I'm a fashion designer living and working in London. We produce all of our clothes within the UK, and we work with menswear and womenswear.
I'm Nick Knight. I'm a fashion photographer, a filmmaker, and I'm also the director of SHOWstudio.
Welcome everyone. So the first question which I want to ask is, do we feel that there has been sufficient commentary and attention around the effect that Brexit is going to have on the fashion industry? When I was looking into this panel discussion and doing my research, it was very, very hard to find voices within the political system who are actively discussing fashion, or even textiles and garments and industries that relate to that. And why is sufficient attention not being paid, or would people disagree? Do they think that people have analysed sufficiently the effect this will have on fashion? I feel like you obviously feel that they haven't.
I do. So I was on the Fabian Women's Network mentoring scheme, and then after it finished last year, my mentor offered me a role which was initially supposed to be 6 months. It in fact went on for 10 and ended about 10 days ago in Westminster. And I got in, and it is a bit like being in or out. And I got in and I had my pass and I had access to all areas, and my real bugbear was Brexit, so I went to every single event that I could, and I literally kept panicking that where were the people that looked remotely like me, that had a background in the creative sector. So after one where Hilary Benn was speaking, where the room was a very different format to what you're seeing here, I asked him if he would allow me to introduce him to some people from the fashion industry, and I tried to join up the dots with that, and I think within about 6 days we had a roundtable. We had a full room of fashion people who were very concerned about Brexit and about the impact and the uncertainty. And then from that we had another one which we held with Matt Hancock, who's the culture minister. And there is, I think it goes two ways. I think it's a lack of lobbying from the sector, from the fashion industry, possibly because then they're possibly issue orientated in their concerns, and also the workloads and job insecurity and lots of other factors, and being international and mobile. And then there's a disconnect with entering into politics. When I went on the mentoring scheme, they told me I was the first person that's ever applied from politics. And I think that's still the case now.
From a fashion background?
From a fashion background. So I think there's a lack of people going into that world to try to learn about it for whatever reasons, and then therefore there's a lack of connection and communication between the two, and that's why there's been so much passion. And it's one thing being upset on social media, but unless the ministers and the policymakers and the advisors actually know what your issues are, how can they understand and other sectors are very coherent in their lobbying and much more cogent in that. So I think
you're nodding to a lot of that, Munira. Tell me your perspective, because this is obviously the field that you're working within.
Yeah, I think that's right, that there is there's often a lack of recognition in the sort of political world of Westminster of the importance of the fashion industry. I think there's more recognition of the creative industries as a whole, and there are really effective lobbyists. I think the fashion industry does actually have very effective lobbyists, and they do try and get through. But there's a more general problem, which is that every single industry feels that it's not being listened to, except with the possible exception of car manufacturing.
Cars
but I think that now we're on a journey, and there is a lot of opportunity in the next year to really influence things. So that's important that the sector comes together. Also, I think there are lots of alliances to be made with other types of industry. So, for instance, manufacturing as a whole, recognising that there's a huge diversity within that label, and that many of the issues that face small designers and manufacturers will be common with other sectors. So rather than being quite siloed and only thinking in terms of the industry as we know it or experience it, it's actually making those useful alliances.
But then you raise an interesting point there, because making the alliances with other manufacturers, I think it's interesting and obviously very helpful in terms of the purely sort of pragmatic financial difficulties or issues that might be raised by Brexit. But I think there's the other side of that, which is more a sense of feeling within the creative community that maybe can't be associated with other manufacturers. There's two issues at play that are caused by Brexit. I think some of them are really pragmatic financial problems that will hit young designers, and the others relate to how London Fashion Week, how the designers working within Britain are perceived. And Hadley Freeman wrote something in The Guardian. It was a very witty piece, but I thought it struck a really interesting note where she said, I think the ultimate problem is bigger than visas. It's so much in fashion is about image and association. Italian labels suggest Dolce Vita glamour, French labels promise chic, British labels more than any other country play on national stereotypes, idea of heritage, the tweed, the crown, punkish rebellion, and most of all a kind of gonzo creativity in which Britain has always taken pride. And what image in Britain do we now in our post-Brexit era project on the global stage? And I think that's really interesting, because a lot of, I think what the fashion industry here is really proud of is a sense of diversity and being a melting pot, and that people come to our amazing fashion schools from all over the world. So there's kind of these two problems. I explained that in a very long way. I hope that was coherent.
Well, I think you're right. There's all sorts of issues. It depends which part of the industry that you're talking about. I think in terms of going back to the original question about has there been enough lobbying, there's been an awful lot of work that UKFT and in conjunction with the British Fashion Council have done behind the scenes. Now, we might not have been waving the flags from the barricades, but we have been talking to pretty much every single government department, every single minister,
and have they been receptive?
And even down to the Prime Minister. I've had conversations with the Prime Minister about the impact of Brexit, and it was a very short conversation, but getting those points across. They are listening. I mean, I will say that they are listening. Whether they're going to make a difference, we'll have to wait and see. But there has been a lot of talk. There's been a lot of understanding, and I think where we probably haven't done ourselves service is that we haven't necessarily pushed forward the industry before Brexit. So when you go and talk to people and tell them that there's 110,000 people in manufacturing, that £70 billion is spent on the high street in terms of clothing, that we make all sorts of things from Formula One nose cones to the fantastic creations that Phoebe puts down the catwalk, everyone is completely gobsmacked about the size of the industry, and that's where we've possibly missed a trick beforehand. But and it's, we are working with, again, a lot of the other trade associations, the Engineering Employers Federation, which is proper manufacturers, again, the car industry we work with quite closely, the Creative Industries Federation. So, and it's what surprised me is that what I thought were fashion-specific issues actually apply across every single sector. It doesn't really matter whether you're talking about a fashion model or whether you're talking about an opera singer. The issues are exactly the same, and so a lot of the industries have.
What are your main concerns? So when you're speaking to these figures, what are you pushing? What are you particularly?
If you sort of give it a sort of 30 seconds pitch, it's about talent. So that's both the ability to let students from the EU come into our fantastic fashion colleges, where a lot of sort of the companies like Erdem and Mary Katranzu, those sort of people. But it's also about accessing the fantastic manufacturing talent that's in the European Union as well. And if you just take London as an example, there's 13,500 people making things in London for the fashion and textile industry. Over 70% of those are Europeans because they have the latent skills. It's still taught in schools. We don't have that in the UK. So talent is an absolute key priority. Intellectual property is another one. So the protections that the EU intellectual property rights give us are absolutely fantastic, and if we lose those, we run a real risk of the design industry in particular.
Yeah, I believe the British Fashion Council have already said that this could effectively put an end to London Fashion Week, because if people had to show in Europe first to have this intellectual property sort of
very
security.
basically, currently, if you send a collection down a catwalk at London Fashion Week, it is protected throughout the whole of the EU. Unless we replace that protection as we leave the EU, then they do run the risk of not only having to protect that unregistered design mark in the UK, they also have to register it in the rest of the European Union as well. So there's that. International trade is the third one, and that's both imports and exports, because whilst I'm a huge believer in UK manufacturing, and I support a lot of people who make things here, the vast majority, 94% of the stuff that we all buy as consumers is imported from overseas. So it's not only about how do we access the European Union as a huge market. The EU accounts for 74% of all of our exports. It's how do we make sure that we still have access to sourcing countries like Bangladesh. We import £2 billion worth of garments at wholesale prices from Bangladesh. We're the biggest importer from Bangladesh of everyone in the world. Now, if we currently, the reason that we bring in so much, and everyone else join in, sorry, I'm ranting away, is that we get duty-free access to Bangladesh, so we can bring that in without any tariffs whatsoever. When we step out of the EU, and if we haven't got an agreement in place that replaces that tariff-free access, the WTO tariffs that we might have to move to is 25% out of Bangladesh. Put on top of that the 20% currency differentials that we've had that happened immediately we dropped out of Brexit. We're talking about stuff coming out of Bangladesh being 45% more expensive than it currently is. It's going to impact everyone in the supply chain. So the people working in Bangladesh, and the retailers have done such a hard job of trying to increase the way that they work with manufacturers in Bangladesh, increasing the working conditions of the Bangladeshis. If we have to pull out of there because we now have to move to a cheaper sourcing environment, it's going to have all sorts of impacts. So those are the things, the key things. It's skills and talent, IP and international trade, and then there's a series of other things behind that, but those are the three key ones.
So what were you going to say?
I'd say like the single market, but yes, so when the government, which I'm sure they're hoping won't happen, to say that no deal is better than a bad deal, and we go to World Trade Organization levels, that would severely impact the industry, because anything that's made, even if it's made in Britain, there are components of that product which are imported. So if you have tariffs added to, say, the cotton or the thread or the button or the zip, and it's import, and the whole customs issue, I think it opens up a whole level of nightmare upon nightmare for the industry. So I think it's more a case of consistently putting across that message and linking that message up and saying it till it's really understood, because you're working with ministers who haven't come from that background, and to have an innate understanding of other areas where they're much more expert, which is completely understandable.
I think there are similarities there, and the point I was making earlier, and even though ministers may not have a specialist knowledge of the fashion industry, they understand extremely well, from what I have experienced, how internationalised so many supply chains are. And they recognise that there is a challenge to going to WTO tariffs. However, just to present the other side, and I do recognise there's so much uncertainty, and there is nervousness, understandably nervousness. There are also potential opportunities, and you said earlier, Lou, about how there's a great deal of fear that we'll become an inward nation, we'll stop trading, that we'll retreat from the world. I think that it's the other way around, actually, and I will come out and say I supported Brexit and I argued for it, because I think that actually we need to turbocharge our engagement with the rest of the world. And even though this is not the ideal way to do it, ideally I would have liked us to be able to reform our relationship with the EU. We couldn't, they tried. And I think we have to try and put our best foot forward and go forward and just try and initiate trade deals with both with the EU and with other countries. We do have a trade deficit with the EU. It's not a guarantee that they'll be sensible enough to want to come to the table and do a proper deal. But there are certain advantages, and I think that, as with all economic uncertainty, practical uncertainty that faces business, and in fact it's not just Brexit, there are other things that face London small designers, the cost of living, affordability, housing. As with all these things, you have to have a balanced assessment, I think, about the strengths of any sector. And actually the UK fashion industry is in a very, very strong position, actually. It has an ability to be resilient. Not every single individual business will have that sense of confidence, but as a sector, actually, there are a lot of positives, and the fact that the brand of being made in Britain is really strong, that there is a huge interest in other markets where we do not currently have a trade deal, like China, with all its attendant risks around copyright.
Just to interrupt you a bit. So this is post-Brexit you're talking, but pre-Brexit, to take us back 2 or 3 years ago, what was a good idea about coming out of Europe? Are you suggesting that actually how you looked at things 2 or 3 years ago, you looked at it and thought, well, actually, we shouldn't really be part of this union. We should be free, and we should be able to trade our people because that's better. Understand now that perhaps we can look at other alternatives to trading with Europe, so we can widen that way. But I'm trying to get what baffles me and has right down from the beginning is why this was a good idea. When I first went to Parliament, Tamara asked us all to come down. I came down. I said to all the ministers there, and it was Hilary Benn and Matt Hancock and some other Labour MPs. Okay, so we've said some negative things because obviously we're all very worried. So what's the good stuff? And they all sat there and said nothing.
Okay.
And Matt Hancock said, well, to be honest, it's not going to sound too good, but Donald Trump's looking very favourably at us for a trade deal. That was the reason to come out of Europe. So what I'm trying to get to, I lived in Europe as a child, so I lived in Paris, I lived in Brussels, so I've always felt more European than just British, so I have to feel nationality at all. But I've always sort of wondered, why was this a good idea? Why did we want to do this? What was so bad about it that we thought we should take all these sacrifices, that we should have all this pain that we're about to go through apparently, to get to what? So nobody's sold me that idea yet. No politicians has come on and said to me, the really good thing about leaving Europe is this, and that's what we should all be doing. I know it's a horrible process, and it's going to hurt people, but in the end we'll be, and it's worth doing. So I'm not trying to put you on the spot here, because none of the politicians have managed to answer this in public or in private. So I'd just like to feel that there was some good reason in some people's minds for doing this, other than the reasons perhaps for xenophobia or immigration or those sort of things which I don't, as you're sure I can guess, I don't agree with.
I mean, without wanting to reopen the debate on Brexit, and I'm conscious that other people haven't had a chance to speak.
Not to do that,
but I think it's a legitimate question. Even after the referendum, why did 17.4 million people decide to vote in this way? And I can, really only speak for myself personally. It certainly wasn't because I was xenophobic.
No.
I think that hopefully that is reasonably clear. And I do think we should have a very strong international engagement with the EU and the rest of the world. I think there are very practical business reasons. Actually, the business community was very divided. There was a strong constituency within the business world that felt that actually being part of the EU was hindering them in a large way, to do with regulation, but also just generally the macroeconomic situation. There is a lot of uncertainty around the euro and the crisis of the euro and the impact that would have on the UK if it remained in the EU. But I think there's a broader political reason that motivated me. I believe that the EU is fundamentally not democratic, and for democratic and political reasons, but also practically, I think a country that is able to direct its own regulation, that's able to direct its own trade deals, that's able to take control of these many different areas, including immigration. And I believe passionate immigration, I think it's a good thing, but I think that it should be something that we control and we should be able to decide. Those are fundamental reasons, and I think sometimes what happens in the creative industries, in the echo chamber that we are, that a lot of people very quickly reduce the reasons for leaving to being about xenophobia, retreating from the world. About 1 million people, it's estimated, from ethnic minority backgrounds voted to leave the EU. From their perspective, the EU is not the be-all and end-all of internationalism. Leaving the EU is not leaving Europe. I still think we should have a good relationship with Europe and with EU member states. But it is about recognising that we have, over the last 40 years, reduced our relationship with many other countries, that there is an opportunity here. I certainly don't underplay the risks and the dangers ahead, but we are in the position we're in. 3 years ago, I didn't think that we would be leaving the EU, to be honest. I thought that would be reform.
And if you could wind the clocks back and have the decision you wanted, would you still go for it? Would you still say everything you know now, you'd still want to go?
Well, actually, I think, before the referendum, during the campaign, there were lots of things asserted about what would happen to the UK immediately after the vote to leave, and then after Article 50 was triggered. And a large number of those things did not happen. And consumer confidence hasn't gone completely. It may well go. Inflation is going up, but it's going up across the whole of Europe. The UK is regarded as the fastest growing of the G8 economies. Many banks, including Bank of England, the Treasury, have revised their economic forecasts because actually what's happened is that the economy has not tanked in the way that people predicted. It doesn't mean that there aren't risks, and I'm completely aware of them. Personally, I think that the political benefits are worth it. But I do think we're in a much more resilient position that was painted during the campaign. So actually, I don't feel a sense of regret. And the evidence shows that the vast majority of people who voted Leave also don't feel regret. And in fact, many people who voted Remain think that we should carry on and now leave and recognise and accept the decision. So the sense of regret isn't really out there.
In terms of that sort of broader general economic view, do you not think that there might be an element of the UK economy is a bit like Wile E. Coyote? We've gone off the edge of the cliff, our legs are still running around like crazy. We just haven't realised that we're not actually on top of anything and we're just going to crash down and the TNT safe's going to fall on our heads.
I like that very precise scientific analysis that...
it's the best I can do. But I think it does demonstrate where I think we possibly might be, and I don't think, particularly in our industry, a lot of the economic impacts of Brexit haven't yet hit.
Exactly.
Well, a lot was made that there was an immediate boost to the fashion industry because obviously people were coming to buy cheap goods, which obviously isn't a long-term sustainable benefit to the fashion industry.
Although it has boosted manufacturing, but
up to a point, it's boosted manufacturing. But to pick up the earlier point, whilst there is a resurgence in UK manufacturing, particularly in the garment side, that is absolutely fundamentally fed by European workers working in the factories here. And then the second point is to pick up that we don't do everything here, and we can't do everything here. We can't grow silk here. We have to import it. There isn't a single zip manufacturer in the UK. So there are elements. Are there opportunities from the result of Brexit? Absolutely there are, and growth in UK manufacturing is absolutely one of them. But in terms of going back to where we started, what we need from government is, number one, please can we have a reassurance that those people that are from the EU that are in the UK can have the right to stay here, end of. It's not a negotiating thing. It shouldn't be a negotiating thing. They deliver a huge amount to this country in all sorts of ways, and particularly to this industry. And picking up on that immigration point, I think, on a broader political view, I've heard some really unpleasant things said to people about, now we've voted to leave, you lot will be out of the country. And I think there's a lack of understanding within a large section of the population that controlling EU immigration will only control 50% roughly of the total immigration that comes into the UK. So there's still going to be an immigration issue. And if we couldn't control it pre-Brexit, how are we going to be able to control it post-Brexit? The customs union is going to have a huge impact. We only make 90 million customs declarations a year across the whole of all industries. And if we're going to miss out on that opportunity to make one customs declaration in Europe for the whole of the EU, we're going to have to get to a whole... Sorry,
I can come back on these points, but I don't want to because I know that Phoebe hasn't had a chance to speak and others.
Phoebe, let's go to you. I'm interested to hear your...
I was just... I've just been thinking about what you said about the talent aspect. It's just something I'm actually quite concerned of, and I think that will be something that will, if people can't come here from other countries, it will be something that will be a very slow, detrimental effect on the fashion industry. If I think about my education at St Martin's and the kind of the people that were in my class, for example, I think there was 3 of us from the UK. It was that international, and that school is it's a very famous fashion school, has a brilliant reputation, and people come from all over the world to study there. And for me, that was the main benefit of going to that university, was to be surrounded by people from every country in the world. It was so rich.
And would you say that those conversations have fed into your aesthetic?
Definitely, because you learn from your peers, and I think that's one of the main standout points for St Martin's education, and for a London education, or for sort of any university education to have the luxury to be surrounded with a peer group that's from all over the world. It's a really rich experience that brings so much to your practice, and the thought of that not being a possibility just seems to me totally bizarre. That, you know, that a career that should be based on stimulation and imagination and inspiration, to not be able to have those opinions and those life experiences that is so rich across the world, and not be able to train alongside them, is just a crying, awful shame.
And I think it's.
Sorry, go ahead.
I mean, I don't think there is a majority of 17.4 million people who want to stop international students coming to the UK. In fact, the largest number of students from abroad is actually from China. It's, you know, in London certainly. It's a very big population. Leaving the EU is not about saying to the world, we don't want your students to come here. And in fact, I think, you know, I would like us to.
Charge more though. Students from the European Union will be charged a lot more if we're outside the European Union.
Yeah,
so
but
those fees will go up.
Yeah,
so
but I do think it's fair that we have a less discriminatory system between the EU and non-EU people who want to come. So if you talk to someone like James Dyson, for instance, he will say there are many engineers that he would like to bring over from India. It's much, much harder for them than it is for someone coming from the EU. So it both affects his business, but he's also involved very much with the RCA. You know, he's got strong universities interests. He's given a lot financially to universities. He believes very passionately that we discriminate against non-EU people. In fact, most of the students who come from the EU are white. And he recognises that, you know, actually this does not send a great message out to the rest of the world. So I would argue for a more humane, a more fair immigration system, which recognises talent, recognises students, which allows us to welcome the world, but is controlled. And I don't think that, you know, the current government always has the right message about immigration, but this isn't about the current government, it's about taking control over this area, and I think that's what politics is about. We're debating now what we think our immigration systems should be, and you know, it's all to play for. That's what we should be lobbying for.
Just a question on the international students, and forgive me if I don't have sufficient information, but I'm curious to understand why sort of, you know, penalise or charge more the EU students rather than looking better at our relationships with non-EU international students coming in.
So non-EU students pay 3 times what EU students and UK nationals pay.
But why? What I'm asking, and the point that you just made is you're acting like, you know, to make everyone's fees the same, but why not make it easier for Chinese students to pay less than bump everyone up to their fees?
Because they offset the costs to run the colleges.
I just worry.
But the point is that this is a conversation you can now have. Universities can now have the conversation about levelling the fee if they wish. They can, you know, they can actually reflect in a non-discriminatory way, which they haven't been able to up till now. You know, and there are lots of different areas where we discriminate against non-EU people in that way. So I agree. There's no guarantee that we become, you know, international, that we do these things, but there's also no guarantee that it will become worse, that we will be turning away people. And there's no evidence that the British public actually wants that. And if you look at polls, what the British public want, they want students to come. They recognise.
But we're thinking a lot about what the British people want, you know, from the public through to sort of politicians and those working within the colleges. But I think it's a perception issue as well. And you know, one of the things that people want to come here, like what the experience you talk about.
For example, like I have very strong EU students who've come to kind of train with me for a few weeks, and having conversations with them where they're asking me, you know, I really wanted to do an MA here, but I don't know if I'll be allowed, and I don't feel welcome here, and, you know, really considering going to a different country to do a fashion MA and not London, which is crazy because London is, you know, it's the place to study fashion. It's very...
And if you look at our fashion week, the people who bring us so much attention are often European, you know, like we've talked about America Transi, she's Greek, Marcus Almeida are Portuguese, and do you have concerns that those people won't want to come? Why would you want to go to a place that has sent a message that you're not welcome?
Well, I have concerns that what happens is that universities at the moment are telling the world that Brexit is about closing off from the world. So I think that they interpret figures with a very negative spin, which is counterproductive because it actually puts people off. And in fact, before Brexit, when I was at the Mayor's office, I remember there was a long discussion about the impact that the government's proposals on immigration were having on Chinese students. And I remember the promotional agency for London was saying, actually it's a little bit counterproductive because we send out the message to the rest of the world that we don't want you. And in fact, we need to tell people, no, you're still welcome. I think, the Mayor of London, the current Mayor of London, saying that London is open is a good message. We want to reinforce that Brexit doesn't stop us from wanting to bring in talent. In fact, there's nothing the government has done so far that I know, which has said that they don't want universities to have international students. So there's a very strong economic reason, but also a cultural reason. And we'd be better off trying to project positively. I think sometimes people, for understandable reasons after the campaign, have tended to focus on the negative, partly because of their own feelings, but it is counterproductive when we're trying to project to the world.
So 14, I've got written here that EU funding equals 14.2% of research funding. I mean, this was from a meeting that I went to. Obviously, if we came out of the single market, I've also got written down, we come out of the funding called the Erasmus Plan, which would have a huge effect. And I'm very much Remain, that's obvious. But if I honestly felt that the UK talent, education system, manufacturing, factories were really being well funded, we could go back to 40 years ago when we had 1 million people, I read, in manufacturing in this country, where we had a really well-funded education system that was pumping people in to fill the jobs of today and tomorrow. I just wouldn't be quite so panicked, but I really panic. Schools are looking at funding cuts, which there's a 6% in 1 year art GCSE decline. There is something like 33%, 41% down in design and technology, 23% fall in craft. So already we're going to have an issue because for the jobs of today, we are not going to have the talent, the domicile talent. And if immigration is going to go down, absolutely, then we need to be pumping money into education, not hitting them with cuts. It to me, that just doesn't add up. Because if you're looking at, okay, we are going to be losing people. Of the people that I interviewed, a third said that they were prepared to leave if the single market was closed off to us, and another third said that they were considering it. I know from several people that I've spoken to in the last couple of weeks that they are looking at Lisbon, for instance, which is making very inviting messages to them about we've already got the factories, it's a nice quality of life, etc., etc. I'm sure they've made overtures to you, they certainly have to a lot of people I know. I just wouldn't feel quite so panicked. But not only that, China is pumping money into the creative education system, meaning, I'm sorry, but it doesn't add up. They are in a generation's time, those factory owners that have a talented child are not going to send them to London for an education. They are just going to keep there, and we are going to be irrelevant unless we absolutely strategize creatively towards something really fundamentally engaging, so that there is some kind of creative thinking around solutions that absolutely inject the most we can and lead on technology, lead on design, and lead on creative thinking, and really come up with some energetic solutions. Because it almost has to be a very thoughtful globalisation, because that's now the solution we're going to have to find. And I hope that that's why the government and the Mayor's office, etc., listen, because that's what worries me, is a decline in education in the creative industries, where we don't have a millinery course, we don't even have a bookbinding course, and they are overrun with jobs that they can't meet. Then where are we going to be in 20 years' time?
You were sort of nodding to a lot of that, Phoebe.
Yeah, I mean, if people can't come here, Fashion Week will be empty. There will be no one showing. They just won't be. If you look at the names on the list of Fashion Week, the designers showing, they're not all they're not all UK nationals, they're from all over the world, and the reason we have one of the best fashion industries in the world is because the best students from all over the world and all over Europe can come here to study.
And they want to come here as well.
And they want to come here to study, because
there's the two levels.
Once they're here, they are, in fashion, they're part of British fashion. They're part of our industry, and, it's an all-embracing industry, and it always has been. It was the industry as we know it was founded by a British man going to France and founding couture in France. So it was 2 European nations which came together to fund an industry which is now, you know, a multi-billion dollar thing everywhere around the world. And that was a British man and a French nation coming together. From its inception, it has been about countries coming together. That's how it's always worked. French lace sold in London, Scottish mills selling their tartan in Paris. You know, that's how it works. It's actually how the industry works. So if that becomes harder, or if indeed it becomes not possible for people to come here, how on earth is it going to run, and what kind of industry is it going to even be in the end? Would you consider moving? Those offers that you're having at the moment, are those things you're discussing? Well, yeah, there are countries that are going to pick up on the fact that, you know, they've got nice things to offer designers to try and lure them. And, you know, there are countries like China is a huge emerging fashion nation. I mean, it's going to really explode, and I don't think any of us are going to be ready for that. Yeah. And they're going to be able to offer the money for designers to go over there. And if there's no incentives for them to stay here, then why should we stay here?
Can I just make, I think, you know, I completely agree that it's a competitive marketplace out there. There are lots of cities who are trying to build their industries and grow their industries, and we've already got a really successful one. We can't be complacent, we could easily lose it. But I think the point about funding from government and having a more forward-looking strategic approach to nurturing our industries, and, you know, there is an industrial strategy set up by government. Creative industries is put down as a priority sector. The point I would make is that in order for governments to be able to give that kind of funding, it needs to have a strong economy. And there is a fundamental risk with remaining in the EU. It is economically risky both to remain as well as to leave. And the programs like Erasmus, the research funding, that comes from the EU, but that money comes from somewhere. We are a net contributor of that funding. That funding will come back. How we use that funding, how we make decisions about our tax revenue, and how, you know, in the next 10 years what that will look like, growing our tax revenue hopefully, is the stuff of politics. That is what it is to go forward, to lobby, to be part of a debate. Now, you know, you could say, oh well, things were, you know, at least things were okay. You know, with the status quo was at least certain. We knew what it was. A, it wasn't certain. There's no certainty of remaining. There were many risks attached to that. But B, you know, the resilience of the creative industries as well, and its ability to adapt, is one of the things that is quite unique in Britain. It does have some strengths that other countries don't have. And I do think actually it's quite well positioned to go forward. And the only way in which government can really support, at the level I think it should, is if it has the money to do that.
But weirdly, I'm sorry.
So no, go ahead.
It's a cultural thing as well. It's not just about economics and not just about government backing fashion, which of course it should, but also it's a cultural thing. You know, London especially has been a cultural melting pot, you know, since the end of the war. You know, you've had, you know, all these different, you know, you had Francis Bacon in Soho, you had, you know, all the different generations of creators have come here, not because of government funding, because London was such a great, vibrant, cosmopolitan city.
And not because of the EU. You know, they came before the EU was created.
They did come before the EU, but my point is if this country suffers, which it will do, well, certainly the fashion industry and the creative industry will suffer, then they will go elsewhere. And cities like London don't always last forever. Look at the huge, you know, art movement in Vienna. Nobody goes to Vienna anymore. You know, cities have their peaks.
But you're speculating,
and this could be the downside
happen.
of it. It's not about government funding. It's about the cultural attitude within the city. And if we turn into a city which isn't welcoming to foreigners, that doesn't feel that way, just culturally, in that case we'll lose something vital. How much money you stick into something, it isn't going to work.
But I do think that you are making an assumption that it will stop being international. I absolutely don't believe that.
The thing is, we have no idea what's going to happen, so it's very, very hard just to say it'll all be fine, because of course there's a nagging feeling that actually there's lots of reasons saying it won't be
But
fine.
you're assuming the worst case scenario.
But
I
It's
think
a very
it's
different
both,
scenario to one that I think we don't have evidence that is really going to
But this
happen.
comes back to the original question about, so we've done lots of lobbying to government, and this is a this isn't a party political point at all, this is a much broader political point, is that yes, we've been pushing the messages in terms of where our areas of concern are. What we haven't had back in any shape or form is a yes, we're hearing you, yes, it's going to be okay for students, yes, we understand that manufacturing will need more help and support possibly, yes, your export drive will need more help and support, and yes, we'll be able to do all those things because we now have the money that was going into the EU that we can now direct in our own national interests. And we just haven't had that. I mean, I think that's why there's so much negativity or fear about what the future is because we haven't been in any way, shape or form by anybody of any political persuasion reassured that yes, it's all going to be okay. Yes, we understand that the US could be a fantastic market for you, and yes, we will be doing our best to get tariff-free access to the US that we've never had before. Yes, we could be doing
I don't know if that's true, actually. I mean, I'm not here to defend government at all, or any political party, but if you look at the manifestos, if you look at what's been said about global Britain, I think every single political party that is at least accepting the referendum result, there are one or two who don't. But it's a very clear commitment and investment from certainly the Conservative and I believe the Labour Party in their manifestos to support an exports programme. It's a very clear line in there. Now, it might be that it's not getting cut through in the media, but I don't get the impression that any of the political parties are saying we want to stop Britain from being an international player.
I didn't say that they were saying they were going to stop. What they're not coming across in any meaningful way from an industry's perspective is what the benefits would be, and that they're 100% behind those industries.
And I think
if you take the export thing as a key example. I mean, yes, it is a specific item in the Labour manifesto that they will ring fence, not increase, ring fence the support they give for trade show access programs, which is the money that goes to help smaller companies go to overseas trade shows. Right? The entire budget across all industries is less than £8 million. And the fashion industry's budget of that, which is the biggest slice of all, is £650,000. That's all that the government currently give. So all that Labour Party is saying is that they will ring fence that. Reference that against what our European competitors do, and currently they're also our European partners, but they'll be even more so our European competitors. I mean, some of you have heard this statistic before. The Italian fashion industry, the Italian government put $20 million behind the promotion of Italian fashion in New York for one season, and we get £650,000 to promote UK fashion across the entire globe. It's a broader political point. This isn't about Conservatives or Labour. There needs to be a much clearer message coming from the government, coming from Westminster, that yes, we're listening to you, which is one point, and yes, we're going to support you. And I think that's the bit that's missing, and that's why we're all still feeling so nervous.
I completely, I can understand that. But I think my concern is that by projecting the worst case scenario, we accidentally or inadvertently project a message out to the world as well. So I believe, I completely believe you, and I think you're right that the government can and should do more. And hopefully after the election there'll be a bit more stability for them to do that.
I accept the point, but highlighting things like if we don't get a replacement deal for X, Y, and Z, the direct impact will be clothes are 45% more expensive. That's not me scaremongering. That is the reality of what the situation would become. It's so.
But I think, for instance, you have sister associations in the rest of Europe. I would like to see the creative industries working with partners around the rest of Europe to lobby their governments, to lobby the EU to get us a good deal, right? So car manufacturers are talking to their supply chain in other countries and getting them to lobby the German industry associations that will lobby the German government.
And
I think it is recognising, and it's recognising that there is another side to this negotiating table and exerting political pressure. But what tends to happen in the media discussion in the creative industries is a general, our government is not doing anything, and therefore it's all going to go terribly wrong.
Do you think that the government has given an adequate message back to those media organisations within the creative industries to have anything to report to be positive about?
Probably not, but in a way, what is there to report? We're not in a negotiating.
But why would they then change their tune?
We had a meeting with Matt Hancock, who's the MP. We've been meeting at the House of Commons. And he said at the end of the meeting, and look, please take away a positive message and take it out to industry, because there are certain people here in this building, meaning Parliament, who want to pull up the drawbridge and stop this, make us a little island again. So there's certainly forces within Westminster who don't see it your way and who actually want to make it a little England. When his thing was take this positive message out, but they didn't have a positive message. There's no positive message to take out.
I think it's because we still are unclear about our status within the single market.
Of course, yeah.
And I think that, I was speaking with an entrepreneur yesterday from the accessories sector who is now doing startups both in Britain and globally. And she was saying that she was just about to start in June of last year in the UK, and now everybody's stalling, manufacturing, the funding, everything's stalling, whereas in other countries, and they're not just in Europe, they're global, it's going very quickly. So if there was a guy that I was interested in, and for 11 months he had me stalling about what his mum thought or his auntie in Italy, or I'd be like, I'm off. You start to switch off. So you oscillate. I think that's fashion people. We are very quick. We're very creative. We are very resilient. I have lived on insecure income for most of my adult life. So. I didn't really have a pay slip until I went to Westminster. I didn't really understand that I had holiday. The whole thing was just new to me. So that I'm not unusual in the industry. And we are global. And that's what I've tried to say to people. I've said to advisors, we are the soft power. We represent that glamour, that, there's beautiful flowers here. This is a fantastic space. And we are mobile. My husband works in the film industry. He could work for more money in other countries. And we're here at the moment with a child where the school's facing cuts. So I'm already worried about that future. And that's the worry. I love this country. I love this city. My father came here from somewhere else with nothing, from Turkey, and has made a great life here. I think it's the most beautiful, optimistic, resilient country, and we are the beautiful, optimistic, resilient people, but we are faced with an uncertainty. And if after 11 months I was in love with someone that was being a bit vague with me, I would probably start looking over there at other guys, because it's survival, isn't it?
I think also you raise a really interesting point there, which is about the instability within the fashion industry that already exists, and you did raise this earlier on with it was a really intelligent point about things problems that already exist, like cost of housing and access to studios and what have you. Yeah. And I think that's also a really important point to raise, because it's amazing to hear, and we talk about doing the amazing lobbying and conversations that you've been having, but for a lot of our very young designers, maybe 3 or 4 years out of college, who are building these amazing businesses, that the UK prides itself on sort of wheeling out to show how interesting and creative we are. They're working with maybe 2 other people, often from their apartments. They don't have the resources all the time to actually get their voices heard, because they barely have enough money to put together their collections. And I think that's a real problem. Is some of your peers, Phoebe, and maybe yourself, you will not have the time or the means to adequately put across your opinion.
Yeah, I think this is the problem, is it is already so hard. I mean, it is really, really hard on a daily basis. And I think that's one of the most devastating things, is just realizing it's going to get even harder for us. It's going to be really tough, and it's already really hard. And how many people are just going to be broken by that? And how many of them are actually just going to be like, I'm going to where my parents live, it's going to be easy over there, I'm going to leave and just call it a day and do it somewhere else and be really successful doing it somewhere where it's a lot easier.
And you think of all of those things, and it's a loss that you can't measure in a way, because
it's not you quantitative.
Yeah, like whether, who knows if someone of a McQueen like type talent doesn't start their own business, that will have lost out on that, because you would never know.
Just like the last straw. It's really like this. It could be the straw that breaks many camels' backs. Do you know what I mean? It's like, it's already really hard. Here's something on top that's going to make it way harder for you.
I think as an industry as a whole, we're not equally represented. People like British Fashion Council do a very good job for certain parts of the industry, but there are large parts of the industry which are unrepresented, unsupported. And often, the people who are working in their bedrooms or whatever, producing a collection out of nothing, and those people are just not recognised at all. And they have no voice, no voice at all. And it's those sort of people.
Well, I suppose that's a question for the associations and the
Yes,
people who say that they represent the fashion industry.
But that's part of the worry, is a sort of...
I'm not sure if that's entirely true, but
Well, I think
maybe you would come back on that, Adam, and say actually we do represent.
You do, but not all of it. I mean, when McQueen started up, for instance, who was supporting him? Who was recognising him? Yeah, his friends, and that was it. And there were lots of young designers are young, struggling artists trying to make ends meet, and then they work incredibly long hours. There's no structure within this industry. There's no union within this industry. It's not like different industries. It's not like film. It's not like ballet. It's not like anything else. The fashion industry is driven by very young, very vulnerable artists.
Yeah.
When you see them catapulted to power, like for instance John going to Dior or McQueen getting his own brand, you can see how fragile those people are.
Yeah.
And that's where we end up with the problems that we've had with those people. So, it is a very delicate industry. So there isn't a sort of government structure or lobbying voice or anything like that helps.
There's no protection.
But I do think there is a bigger problem with the creative industries and with some other industries as well, which is that it's not very good at looking after its own either. And you could argue that the government should do more, should pump more subsidies. Yeah. But there are some very big businesses who do extremely well and could give more back. Certainly on skills and apprenticeships, which we know in this country has completely dropped, partly because there is cheap labour from abroad.
But will they be inclined to do that after Brexit, do you think?
You might ask the question about whether there should be more incentive for having apprentices and having a much more structured training programme and encouraging businesses to do that, whether that's done by carrot and stick, whether it's done by levies or an apprenticeship levy and so on. But I don't think that, and I completely understand the concerns of any industry or individual designers like Phoebe who are worried about the future. In the short term, there are immediate risks. In the longer term, I've made the bet myself that it will be better in the longer term for the whole country. But I also think that politically it's very important that London and London industries don't keep telling the rest of the UK that your problems are insignificant compared to ours. For a lot of other cities, a lot of other industries around the country, what they've seen is the loss of their industries, the loss of their jobs. They've seen people come in undercutting their wages as they see it. And they see London in the middle of it all complaining about the impact it's having on them. And I just think that narrative is very damaging because that is part of the problem, this idea that London's not listening to the rest of the country.
I think
there are other manufacturing businesses around the country that, and some of those people will have voted to leave and they will have felt that they made the right decision for their business. So it's recognising that I don't think it's as monolithic as a lot of people present, that their industry steadfastly believes one thing. I do think it's probably more mixed, but a lot of people, and I've seen this myself, do not speak out publicly. I know at least one significant person in fashion who sat me down at lunch during the campaign and said, look, I'm going to confess something that I've not told anybody else. I'm voting leave, and I absolutely think we should get out. Now, she won't say it to anyone else, but there will be people out there who believe the same thing. And
did she say why?
Just scared of what people will say. The impact.
No, did she say why she wanted to leave?
EU is massively bureaucratic and anti-democratic, and she thinks it's you'd have to ask her.
Right, I just wondered if she sort of summed up.
I do think there's a really interesting point that you make about how the creative industries can be perceived as very London-centric, and I think that is obviously really important. But one thing, and it kind of relates to something that is quite pragmatic, but I really want to talk about while I've got everyone here, which is this idea of manufacturing within the UK and something that can then be divulged out to these different communities and what have you, because the impression that I've got is that it's just simply not possible. It's interesting that you make all your stuff in the UK, but is it feasible that we're going to have, you mentioned silk before and zips and what have you. Can you just give, for the sake of our viewers and kind of for me, a little breakdown of the feasibility of that?
The manufacturing sector in the UK has been growing over the past sort of 4 or 5 years, and we've gone from a sort of low point of about 80,000 people employed across the whole of the UK, and I accept the point about it's not just London. There are significant areas of manufacturing in Leicester, there's significant areas of manufacturing in the northwest, in Scotland, and in fact, in the West Midlands, all over the place. But there are a variety of things that are fundamentally difficult about manufacturing in the UK. We don't have volume manufacturing left anymore. The volume manufacturing went a significant long time ago, and getting volume manufacturing back into the UK will be extremely difficult. Finding premises, finding the skilled workers. training those workers up, and I completely accept the point that we need to do more to increase apprenticeship take-up. We need to do a huge amount more to make manufacturing and creative industries and design and technology a embedded part of the national curriculum as we go forward. I mean, one of the reasons that the European workers that come over here, who by the way aren't low-paid skilled workers, they are highly skilled workers, are brought into the UK is because they still have those latent skills. And yes, there is an opportunity to grow UK manufacturing, but it's a very long-term thing. You know, we're not going to be able to fill that.
Yeah.
I accept the point that we don't know what's going to happen. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, that we're going to lose access to that European pool of talented workers. It's going to take a long time to train up our own domestic latent talent. And it's those sort of things, again, that we're looking for support and appreciation from governments of whatever colour. But, I mean, we make a variety of stuff in the UK. We produce just over £9 billion worth of product in the UK in the fashion and textile industry. Everything from the shoes I'm wearing to the tie I'm wearing is made in the UK, but it's not just about fashion, it's about the nose cones on Formula One race cars, it's about textiles that go into the road building, it's about textiles that go into the aerospace industry. We make stuff for every single part of it.
But for textiles, the EU is our biggest export, isn't it?
Yeah, the EU accounts for 74% of all of our exports for fashion and textiles, so it's a huge market.
So is that a concern at the moment, is also focusing on growing our manufacturing but not knowing where we're going to be able to export it?
Well, it's partly that, and it's also partly the difficult relationship between UK manufacturing and the UK retail scene. You know, the retail buyers that are currently within a lot of the major high street shops and stores don't know what's on their doorstep, don't know that dealing with a manufacturer that employs 100 people is very different from dealing with a manufacturer who employs thousands and thousands of people in China or Burma or wherever else it might be. So there's a real disconnect between retail and manufacturing. There are some great examples. ASOS is one of where they work very closely with UK manufacturers to upskill them. They put a lot of money into skills and training, and they are growing their UK manufacturing base, partly because, to be frank, they want to de-risk their supply chain. They don't want the issues of finding that they've got children working in their factories that they're working with in places like Turkey, and they'd much rather work with the people that they can get in the car and drive up to Leicester or jump on the tube and go and see the guys in London and understand that what's going through the process, both in terms of quality and in terms of employing correctly and paying national minimum wage and living wage is all being done. So there are opportunities there, but there are difficulties. Understanding what the export market's going to be, understanding what the implications of import tariffs will be on the pricing structure, dealing with retail, getting them to understand how the UK manufacturing is different. So there's all sorts of issues, but absolutely there are opportunities to grow the manufacturing base here.
Phoebe, do you feel protected or concerned given that your stuff is made within the UK?
Well, I suppose, I'm probably a bit unusual because I do make everything in the UK, despite being repeatedly advised not to for several years now. And I make it here because it is close to me and it makes sense to make it here, and because it reduces the fuel used to ship things. And I believe that wherever you can try and save that, then you should. But there are things within my manufacturing that I can't do here. So, for example, particular types of fabric I can't get from UK mills because there's such a small amount of fabric made in the UK. I'm right, aren't I? Yeah. It's
depends
hard.
what type of fabric.
Yeah, I mean, very, very expensive luxury fabric is easy to find in the UK. But if you want, a plain shirting fabric, that's harder. So there are things, and again, zips, buttons, things like that I have to get from other places. So kind of making everything here doesn't mean that I don't need to go anywhere else to find things in order to get a finished product.
I'm going to set up a zip manufacturing business.
I'll join you. That sounds great. We can all live in the zip utopia together.
Yeah, zips are a constant battle. But yeah.
I'm conscious of time, but I'm interested. I'm interested. A lot of us have talked about this idea that we don't know what's going to happen. I think it'd be really interesting to end this on a note of looking forward, and it can be, a big hope, or it can be something really specific that you'd like to see addressed. I'm just interested in moving forward what everyone's main short-term or long-term concern is, and something that they feel is really, like any closing notes that you have basically tomorrow. I know that's a huge question. You've probably got a manifesto that you'd like to deliver.
So, first of all, the creative education needs to be in the DNA of the education remit for this country so that we can boost our own talent. Second of all, we have to be looking to invest in manufacturing. Third of all, we have to look at our tariffs. And you know, Matt Hancock brought up Hong Kong has zero tariffs. We have to start looking. We also have to try to work out a way of enticing big business to have their taxation here, and then try to offset, I think, that with some kind of investment strategy, apprentice strategy, for them to invest in the smaller industries and the SMEs. I think that the two have to go hand, but we have to start bringing people in instead of fleeing. We also have to address the sustainability issue, which Phoebe just highlighted, because that is protected under EU law. Baroness Young was very concerned at the first Roundtable, who heads up the Sustainability All-Party Group, about losing that protection. You know, really the air miles of export, when it's further, when it's a different culture, when it's a different body shape, when it's a different history from Europe, is an aspect to any future export business. And, you know, flying something to China, flying something to America, flying something to India, I agree we're already importing massively from them. But if we're going to start exporting, you know, that adds up air miles. So that's also, and we've just got to work on those protections as well.
Any final note? You look slightly defeated.
No, not at all. I mean, it's a great discussion. If I thought that we were going to lose 74% of our exports because we weren't trading with the EU anymore, I wouldn't have voted to leave either. I don't think that's going to happen. And actually, you know, if you look at the bigger picture, since the UK joined the single market, our exports to the EU have not gone as fast as other countries that are outside the single market. I mean, there's a lot of myths about how good the single market has been for the UK, and you know, lots of economists have debated that issue. Actually, the country that we export the most to, creative industries-wise, is the US. EU as a whole, you know, the numerous member states are larger, but actually the US is a massive export market for the creative industries. We have no trade deal with them yet. And the EU has not been great at doing trade deals with these other big export markets. So I think there are opportunities. But I completely take the point, and I agree with everyone here, that it does mean that we have to be much more strategic about how we grow our industries, how we grow our trade, how we grow our exports. The problem has been for a long time that the EU has taken away a lot of that function. So we've not thought for ourselves, we've not really done it. The money that goes into regional development is given to the EU to give back to us. I think we should control our regional development, and we would do it much more intelligently. I worked in regional government, and I know for a fact that we were distributing money much better than Whitehall would have. I do think these things work better often, closer to home. I think there are risks. As with any strategy, if we'd remained in the EU, we might be having a very different discussion about what's going to happen. I'm optimistic about many things, but I don't pretend at all that it's plain sailing. But you know, nothing in life is.
The two key things, I think, that if you're asking me what the benefits could be, international trade is absolutely one of them. US, prime example. I mean, we export about £325 million worth of fashion and textile products to the US. UK product in the US is about 25-35% more expensive in the US than it would be in the UK because of all sorts of technical issues in terms of imports and all the rest of it. If we could get a free trade deal with the US as an example, then that would be a fantastic, huge opportunity for this industry. And the other area where we could probably have a significant impact is if we could make our public procurement look towards our UK manufacturers. The US, again, brilliant example.
We're not allowed to.
The US military, everything the US military wear has to be made in America. How cool would it be if everything that the UK military had to wear was made in the UK?
Get them in Phoebe English, it would look very snazzy.
Wow, a new area.
Any final notes?
Yeah, I think for me it's talent, and yeah, just as a closing point, would like to talk about my own experience of the Erasmus programme and how much it fundamentally changed my life, not only as a person but as a designer. I mean, it was an opportunity. I spent 9 months in Paris and 3 months in New York, and there's no way I would be the person I am now without having that money to give me the opportunity to be in those incredible places and train under amazing designers. So I really hope that when we lose Erasmus, there is something else that's set up in its place, because I cannot stress enough how life-changing that experience was, coming from a family that would no way have been able to fund my year living abroad. It was an incredible opportunity, so I really hope that when we do lose it, there's something else set up in place.
I've got to interrupt, sorry. There are loads of non-EU countries that participate in Erasmus. We can continue to pay in. So I agree, it's a brilliant scheme. We should keep being part of it. There's no reason why we shouldn't.
It's really important. I mean, just talking to students this year who know they might not get it, I mean, they're just totally distraught. It's such a life-enhancing thing to be able to do, and career-enhancing, of course, as well. Yeah, that's my main.
Nick, any final
thoughts? Try to be positive. I think the one thing that perhaps and I do actually like to be positive and optimistic. The one thing I think that is positive coming from all of this is the fact that government are now listening to what the fashion industry is about, rather than scandalising and trivialising it. And I think that goes to some degree for the British media, who have largely been responsible for the very bad view of what the fashion industry actually is. So I think now they realise that we put in 28 billion pounds into the economy per year, and I think the government actually listening and trying to find out who people like Phoebe are, you know, how it works, etc., that's beneficial, I think. So a little bit more of I'm come very much from rather than creative industries, I'm very much from the fashion industry, although it's part of it. But I think that's really important. Fashion has had a very poor deal. And a very, very poor understanding of actually what it does and the artists that work within it. So I think support, if that comes from this, then that'll be a good thing.
I think that's a really good point. And on your topic of just conversation, the importance of discussion, I think that's something that'd be really great, is that if our viewers can respond to this and post in the YouTube comments, and we can feed that back, and because we work a lot of our viewers are within the industry, so it'd be really interesting to hear what other people say. Thanks so much for joining. It was fantastic to have people who have such different areas of expertise and obviously different opinions. I think that's really, really important in these kind of discussions. You used the word echo chamber before, and I think what's really interesting about this is that I think we've allowed a sort of an open forum to hear from different perspectives. I want to end with a quote from Andrew Groves, who is a brilliant, brilliant course director of the BA in Fashion at the University of Westminster, and an amazing man. And I think we all talked about optimism, and I think it's a nice note to end on. And he said, "At the end of the day, I'm hopeful. We are a creative industry, and we always react to things in a creative manner, which is normally a positive manner, however it's expressed." So I think that's something to take away. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining.